Welcome to Carefree Conscious with me, Suzanne Wilson, the Carefree Medium. Today, on Proof of Heaven, academic neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander III, whose career includes decades as a physician and associate professor at Harvard Medical School, was once completely committed to the materialist worldview, the belief that the physical world is all that exists. What changed Dr. Alexander's mind? He died and came back. In fact, his entire belief system was forever altered by his 2008 near-death experience, or NDE, a journey into another realm during a week-long coma. Despite doctors' prognosis that he would not survive, he awoke to make an unbelievable return to full health. His medical case and recovery were validated in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, and since his NDE, Eben has been reconciling his amazing experience touching with the other side of life, with quantum physics, cosmology, and the philosophy of the power and the beauty of the mind. He speaks around the world to educate people about the role that consciousness plays in our lives. His books are available in more than 40 countries, with a combined 2 years sitting atop bestsellers lists throughout the world. First, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife, followed by The Map of Heaven, how science, religion, and ordinary people are proving the afterlife, and Living in a Mindful Universe, a neurosurgeon's journey into the heart of consciousness, co-authored with Sacred Acoustics co-founder Karen Newell. I have interviewed Dr. Eben Alexander previously and had met him briefly before his first book was published. There was something special about that guy even before I knew his story of his near-death experience. And I think that you're going to find that there is a lot special about what he has to share with us and teach us about unity consciousness, about the power of sound and healing, and about the fact that we need to appreciate each other here and now on earth based on his integrating his learning from his near-death experience. Eben, we're happy to have you here.
Well, Suzanne, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you today.
And it's wonderful to have you back. I have to tell you, and we were talking earlier, I met you in 2012 at a conference, and your first book had not been published yet. And a mutual colleague came over to a group I was standing in and said, "This guy's book is going to change the world. It's going to be a #1 New York Times bestseller." And I thought, well, that's really sweet and supportive to do for a friend, right?
Well, it is. And I know who you're talking about. So
Let's start with, before we get into the experience, which my attendees here that are with us live are part of my community. It's an online community called the Carefree Souls, and they'll be able to ask questions in a little bit. But I'm sure most, if not all, are familiar with your experience. Some of our viewers aren't. But let's start with what happened.
okay. Well, I think it's important to point out that this all happened 14 years ago in 2008. At that time, I was 54 years old, had spent 15 years teaching at Harvard Medical School, teaching neurosurgery. I thought I had some understanding of brain, mind, and consciousness. I'd been very influenced by my father. I was adopted, so this is my adoptive father who raised me, and he was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. And for him, there was never any conflict between all of his scientific knowledge and his belief in a loving personal God and the power of prayer, which he used in his healing all the time. But like many who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I was one who knew that science is the pathway to truth. And as much as I wanted to believe a lot of what I heard growing up in that Methodist church in North Carolina, I knew that science was going to point the way. And like so many in today's culture, I made the mistake of believing that, an outmoded version of science, which is what the public is given in the current era, this materialistic, physicalist, Newtonian deterministic science that basically lets materialist neuroscientists claim that you don't even have free will. They say it's all, electron fluxes, chemical reactions in the brain, but they're wrong. And that is where the scientific world is headed on this question now. In fact, I would say scientifically, we proved the reality of the afterlife in many ways, and we can get into that part of the discussion. But for me, what happened November 10th, 2008, was I very suddenly, over just a few hours, 3 hours or so, went from severe back pain, severe headache, into deep coma and seizures. All that happened while I was at home. And when the EMTs came to the house and tried to break the seizures, they couldn't do it. Now, I remember nothing of the next 7 days because I was gone from this world. But that is, of course, the part that garners such interest in the scientific community, because not only are the details as I presented in Proof of Heaven, but there's a medical case report by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery, which, by any kind of medical expectation is truly a miraculous recovery. And that's why they wrote the case report that came out in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in September 2018. But anyway, what happened to me, and it's important to stress that one of the atypical features of my near-death experience was that I was amnesic, that I had no memory of my life on Earth. I had no words, no language, none of my religious conceptions, none of my scientific knowledge, none of my personal memories. Every bit of it was deleted. And of course, in the early weeks and months after my coma, I explained all that because I was beginning to get through my medical records and realize just how badly damaged my neocortex was. But the thing is, those memories, which were still gone when I woke up in the ICU room on day 7 of coma, returned over about 2 months. That's the part that's really kind of shocking. But anyway, what happened in this amnesic state of my NDE was a tremendous spiritual journey. And the important thing made clear in that case report is that the objective damage to my brain was very clear from the medical record. That was not a brain that could have produced any dream or hallucination.
Yes.
And that's why my story is so important to the scientific community, because it really is impossible from the tenets of modern neuroscience, and yet the whole thing happened. And then you still have to explain my recovery, which is unprecedented in the medical literature, to have such an extraordinary recovery. Glad he was sharing that.
Your brain was a sack full of pus, rotten pus. Sorry to be gross, but how do you confabulate, make stuff up, or dream anything with a sack full of pus, right? And was it a type of meningitis that only babies would get?
Right.
It was weird that you would have that.
Well, that's part of the mystery. And of course, to my doctors, that was a huge shocker. I explained a lot of that in the book Proof of Heaven, but they were dealing with E. coli meningitis in an adult. And that almost never happens. Most patients with that disease are newborns. It's very rare to have it in somebody over 3 months old. So I guess you might comment on my level of maturity, but the reality is, my doctors were deeply mystified by this diagnosis. To this day, we have no idea how I came into that disease, and certainly no idea how I recovered fully from it. Although I think once you open your mind to the deeper aspects of spiritual journeys, it becomes clear that this was a journey that was meant to unfold in this extraordinary way. But of course, that also demanded that I accept the deep lessons of the journey as a scientist,
yes.
As someone who cared deeply about consciousness, the brain-mind connection, the nature of reality. And that's what I have done for the 14 years since my coma. I work with scientists around the world trying to better understand these phenomena. And it's important for me to clarify, I've heard hundreds of NDE experiences that I would say easily are right in the same ballpark as mine. So what really lends such importance to my story is not the nature of the NDE, because there are many such spiritual experiences that people have had, very profound, that people have gifted me with, that have greatly strengthened my understanding of all this. I look at my NDE as really important, mainly because of the medical details of that meningoencephalitis. And
the materialist scientists are just looking at data. They're looking at, the scans of your brain while you were ill, the scans of your brain afterwards, your recovery. And, so it's meant to happen so that you could be an example. But Eben, you could have just as easily ignored the whole thing, continued to keep it to yourself, because you kept it to yourself. You write in the first book that you kept it to yourself for a while because you didn't want anybody to think that you were crazy. So why did you choose? What made you choose? What made you integrate this experience?
I think the important thing to understand is when I first woke up from this coma, extraordinary spiritual experience that we can get into in a few minutes, but it could not have happened according to modern neuroscience. Given the damage to my brain, that brain could not have supported it. So how could I have the most robust, profound, detailed, memorable, and life-changing set of events in my life when my brain was demonstrably offline? There was no way that brain was going to have a dream or hallucination. And so when I first came back to this world on day 7 of coma, I didn't even recognize loved ones at the bedside, my mother, my sisters, my sons, my former spouse. I had no idea who they were. And yet I knew fully this beautiful journey I had just been on. And as I tried to explain it to my doctors, they would pat me on the back and say, well, your brain was full of pus. We don't even understand how you're coming back to us now. But you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Now, remember that at that point, early days and weeks after coma, most of my neuroscientific and scientific knowledge was still buried in that amnesic phase, even though it all came back extraordinarily over 2 months. But I believe my doctors, they said it had to be a hallucination. And I remember my oldest son, Eben the fourth, who had been there at the bedside during many of the days deep in my coma, but he was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. He knew that every time you revisit a memory, you change it. And so when he came home to visit me 2 days after I got out of the hospital, when I was just chomping at the bit to read every book on near-death experiences and consciousness, physics, et cetera, to try and understand this, he said, no, don't do that until you've written down everything you can remember from your own experience. Because I'd never paid any attention to the NDE literature. And he was right. And so I wrote about 20,000 words over 6 weeks. Only then did I dive into the NDE literature and was absolutely shocked and amazed to find the similarities with my own journey across all belief systems, continents, across millennia, etc. But when he first came to the house 2 days after coma, day before Thanksgiving, 2008, he gave me a big hug, and he told me later it was like there was a light shining within me, like I was far more present than I'd ever been. And I remember telling him at the time, it was way too real to be real. That's basically the lesson I took from my doctors, who told me it had to be a hallucination. I knew it was shockingly real. In fact, this world seems very kind of murky and dreamlike compared to that world. And that was something I couldn't understand. So I thought, wow, had to be fantastic hallucination, but it demands explanation. And then as I was going back to the hospital over weeks and months, reviewing my medical records, looking at my scans, talking over those neurologic exams and all the details of my case with the doctors who took care of me, we were all deeply mystified. And that's the story I tell much more fully in the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, was that deep mystery with those fellow doctors. In fact, the county medical society invited me to give a talk on the experience with more than 120 doctors and their spouses and all in attendance a few months afterwards. They were all shocked by this recovery, as I was becoming more and more shocked as I learned more about my own case, and also remembering the vivid details of what I experienced. It was finally, I had to realize, my God, especially with all the overlap with other NDEs, it started showing me these NDEs are absolutely real. When I knew my brain didn't create it, that it had to happen in the setting of my brain being inactivated, just as like what happens to all of us when our brain and body die. We're liberating from the shackles of this kind of prison of the illusion of here now and this sense of self, because essentially it turns out from a scientific viewpoint, we're really sharing one consciousness, and that supporting, what we know from NDE experiences, that infinitely loving God force that's so comforting at the core of the universe, I came to see as the very source of our conscious awareness. And so to me, this completely shifted my worldview to go through all this extraordinary experience. But the important thing is you asked the question, why did I go forward with this? Well, that is the story of this, month after month of discovery, understanding. Oh my God, this seemed too real to be real because it really happened, but not in the physical realm. That was what finally kind of pushed me over the edge when, as I describe in the book, Proof of Heaven, towards the end, the identity of that beautiful spiritual guide that accompanied me through much of the journey, the beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing. And when I discovered her identity, wow.
So really meeting up with a relative that you had never seen before, never met before, and only recently had discovered that you even had, that is sort of like the tipping point that said, you got to share this. You've got to integrate this. You've got to share how you integrated it. You have 3 books. They each stand on their own, but they're a trilogy that if you read them all, you can get a sense of the experience of how you've brought a little bit of heaven to earth to share with
people. Very much.
And I've got to tell you, with this whole, you've been on a webcast with me before, and we've, passed in the hallways, like ships in the night at conferences and things like that. But one of the things that fascinates me most here is meeting that relative. This webcast started because I wanted to somehow honor the 15th anniversary of my 2007 NDE, and you had yours in 2008. And my grandfather, who was my mentor, who passed away when I was a young teenager, a Presbyterian minister who saw clairvoyantly, who was a closeted medium himself, had his arms around me, and he was there. And I had anaphylaxis, popped out of the body, heard the pop like it was a champagne cork popping from down the hall somewhere, and was observing myself sitting there trying to breathe with doctors working on me, and looking at the back of my head and feeling my grandfather's arms around me. And I wanted to go to where the lights were coming from, to where the wonderful music was coming from. You felt that familial connection with this etheric woman that was with you, but you did not know who she was then. Talk about that.
Well, that to me is, it makes my heart pound and kind of sends chills up my spine to even revisit that, because it's such an absolutely beautiful part of the story that to me was kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back of my resistance as a formerly materialistic neuroscientist to go, oh my God, and finally get the bigger, deeper message about all this. But there's a lot to that story, and I don't want to take up too much time and go into too much detail, except along the directions that you'd like to take it. But the reality is I was adopted, and that plays importantly in my whole life story. My birth mother was 16 years old. She was unwed. I know that at age 11 days, I failed to thrive. So I was actually hospitalized at age 11 days. So in many ways, social services then took me away from my birth mother. Now, the thing is, she was tacitly agreeing with all that, but also she didn't want to let me go. And so I was in this kind of limbo state in this baby dorm for 4 months, because she would not sign the papers to put me up for adoption until finally at 4 months, she decided she had to do something. And that was the something she did. Now, I know my father, the neurosurgeon, my adoptive father, used to tell me, you cannot possibly remember anything that happened to you when you were, weeks or months old. And in that, I know he was wrong. because even though I didn't have a specific kind of linguistically based memory of being put up for adoption, it turns out that that smoking crater of my mother leaving me behind set the stage for my whole life of being one not necessarily trusting in the universe. And I think the way that manifested in my life as I grew up and into an adult was a certain kind of doubting of my that I deserve to be loved. I mean, that was essentially it. I think other people who've been through abandonment wounds, whether it's adoption or what have you in their early childhood, they can have a similar kind of self-doubt and problem. And I faced that through much of my life. And even though on the surface everything seemed fine and I was doing well and accomplished, I think that it did affect my relationships and kind of the way I was. And that kind of lack of trusting in the universe was part of it. But then also, of course, that wondering if I was even worthy of existence.
Like you're not thinking of it every day, but on the subconscious level, it's affecting you. Do you feel like that was part of like a setup for the experience yet to come?
I think it absolutely was. And that's why it's so important that I went through most of my life not knowing my birth mother. I mean, originally that was my thought, was I'd like to reconnect with my birth mother. So I wrote letters to the North Carolina Children's Home in my teens and 20s. Is she out there? Is she looking for me? Always got the same answer. No, forget about it. She's moved on. You should too. And that's fine. I mean, don't get me wrong. I couldn't have been more fortunate and blessed in my life. I was adopted into a beautiful, loving family. I have 3 sisters. My parents honored all my hopes and dreams. I couldn't have been more fortunate. So this is not some sob story. But the reality is I still had that smoking crater. And it was it's something you can't even get to, because so many of our memories very early on are formed differently from the memories we can get to linguistically in later life, like after the age of 7, where we basically use kind of a linguistic model to access memories and associate thoughts and all that. And this is from a much earlier time, very primitive. But that was really the challenge I faced, was worthy of life or not. And that's why it's so important that in the year 2000, this is all told in the book, Proof of Heaven, my older son, Eben IV, he was in 6th grade up in Massachusetts, and he had a project for school on family genealogy. And I remember him telling me, Dad, we have to reach out to your birth family again. I thought, oh my gosh. That again, I was used to that rejection. So it turns out I wrote a letter to the children's home on his behalf, seeking more information. And it turns out that, and this part of the story gets, I don't know how deep to go, but it's important to at least mention that when I trained in neurosurgery in the mid-'80s, I focused on vascular aneurysms, arteriovenous malformations. That was my passion. And that's what I studied. I did 2 years of research. I did a year fellowship, all of this stuff to be a vascular neurosurgeon. And that was in the mid-'80s. Fast forward to this year 2000, when actually what I learned from the children's home is that my birth family had been keeping in touch with them, but it wasn't my birth parents. It was a sister. And that birth sister knew, because of a spat between her mother and grandmother back in 1987, that I existed. In that spat, the grandmother spilled to the sister that her parents had a son out of wedlock, early on, that would be an older brother to her. And the grandmother said it in an off-the-cuff remark and then walked away. It was like she dropped a grenade into my sister's life. But once my sister knew that, she asked around the family, and nobody would admit to it. But she did. She waited several months to ask her mother, and when she did that, our mother, and when she did, Barbara said, "Yes, we did. We had the son. He died in Vietnam. Forget about it. Never mention it again." And that was in '87. So this is 13 years later.
Yeah.
But what happened, and the reason this is so crucial, this aneurysm study that I was doing in my career, is that the whole reason that my birth sister was keeping in touch with the children's home was because in 1965, my birth mother's father died of a subarachnoid hemorrhage. In fact, he was probably seen in the hospital by my own dad months or weeks later. And then in 1978, my birth mother's youngest sister died of a subarachnoid hemorrhage from an aneurysm. So that was a family history. My sister knew that was a biologically inherited condition. And so she wanted to warn me. And she did that through writing letters to the children's home. And it was that connection that in the year 2000, when I finally reached out to them, connected the dots. But it came to me in extraordinary form. Again, this is in book Proof of Heaven. But in that form, I'd written the letter on behalf of my son to try and get more family history. And then I remembered on a Friday afternoon driving up to go skiing in Maine during a blizzard with my son in the back seat. Oh, yeah, this is the day to call the social worker. And I called her up and I expected to get the same, oh, yeah, there's nothing. She's not out there. Forget about it. Well, I didn't. I got a 2-minute message. And that is, well, guess what? Your birth parents got married. I cannot tell you what a shocker that was. That was the biggest surprise of my life. And then she said they had 3 children, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That would have been in 1998. And because of that loss, they're still grieving, and it's not a good time to come back in their lives. It turns out that most of that was kind of made up by the social worker in terms of the reasoning behind it.
Right.
But the reality was I perceived it as a rejection. And when you read the adoption literature, you find out if an adoptee gets another rejection from the birth family later in life, it can really tip them over. And this one tipped me over big time. In fact, I went into a dark night of the soul from the year 2000 forward. I stopped taking my sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. Really doubted a loving personal God and power of prayer, just left it behind in my life. But then 7 years later, 1 year before my coma, walking on a beach in South Carolina, 2 of my adoptive sisters, Betsy and Phyllis, said, don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family again? And that's when I went, oh my God.
Wow, I have chills on the timing of this. This is great. But you're not going to see what she looked like. You're not going to see what your sister looked like before your coma.
Right. And that was kind of the shocker. You know, I had some vague ideas, but nothing like what happened 4 months after coma. And I remember I did meet, my birth parents, October 5th, 2007. That all is reported in Proof of Heaven. That was an extraordinary experience of my life. We spent a lot of time in touch over the next many months. Then, the coma happened a year after that, November 2008. And that's why it was so important that all those connections had been made in terms of meeting the birth family and every bit of that. And then 4 months post-coma is when the picture that Kathy had promised to send me, that's my other birth sister who's still alive, and that picture arrived and it came, and there was this poem emblazoned, When Tomorrow Starts Without Me, a beautiful poem. It's in the book Proof of Heaven, and just an extraordinary poem. But that picture was hauntingly familiar to me. And it turns out this all happened over about an 18-hour period. I got that picture in the mail. I looked at it. Tears filled my eyes. I was just overwhelmed with emotion looking at this beautiful sister. I put the picture up on my dresser. And it was the next morning when I was reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, Life After Death, on page 28. There's a story of a girl, I think she was 12 years old, and she had this deep coma experience, was welcomed to heaven by her brother, incredibly beautiful NDE, and then she came back to this world. But as she's explaining it all to her father, she says, but I don't understand. I don't have a brother.
All right.
And the father says, well, you did have a brother, but he died 3 months before you were born.
And she did not know. I love that story. I love that book.
And that's when I looked up at that picture on my dresser. Oh my God. I collapsed on the floor on my knees. I couldn't even stand up for 30 minutes, heart pounding. All of a sudden, the whole thing made sense. In the picture, it's like she's looking at me. Do you finally get it? And yes, Betsy, I finally get it.
So, people talk about their experiences being met by someone. Almost every NDE account I've read, someone meets them, someone helps, someone guides a loved one, a religious figure, whoever it may be. But you didn't know about NDE data when you're having this experience. You're not looking for someone. You don't know what she looks like. I mean, this is the epiphany. Too many synchronicities, too many things happening, and it puts you on your path. Well, what would you advise people who have had a near-death experience and don't know what to do with it, or don't know how to integrate it? And I'll give you some context here. For me,
I was secretly studying psychic and intuitive abilities. I was sitting in a mediumship development circle because I had a lifelong gift, but I was very much ashamed of it and hiding it because I wanted to succeed. I had great jobs in academia and in university, different structures and fundraising. And then I went into the private sector and I've got my stock options, my big house and all this. I don't want to give that stuff up. And then I get the NDE and then I have conflict because now all I want to do is connect with spirit. So I took up drinking, heavy drinking. Mm-hmm. I was well on my way to becoming an alcoholic because I didn't want to decide how to integrate this experience. I since have. I walked away from how my life was then. But what do you say to people who are like, it's not clear to me why this happened. It's not clear to me what I'm supposed to do. I don't know if this has made me more spiritual. Do you have advice for people like that?
Well, I think the most important thing is to live from the heart, be authentic, admit your experience and what you've been through. And then I think it's important to learn more about them, to read various NDE books. Now, there are some excellent websites out there where people can share their experience. So these are repositories for thousands of such experiences that have been vetted by professionals who really kind of keep track of this. One of those groups is the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANDS.org. I highly recommend not only that you share your experience there, but for people who haven't had experiences, start learning more about them on that website. There are other very good websites that collect this kind of data, like Jeffrey and Jody Long out of Louisiana have a beautiful NDERF website where they share and invite people to share their stories. So the first important step is to learn more about it. Read some of these other accounts. Realize that the scientific community is right there with you. Because these, people used to say, oh, you're either scientific or you believe in this woo nonsense of an afterlife. Well, the bottom line is we've now moved beyond that point. And for example, I would recommend to all of the viewers, there was a contest last year run by Robert Bigelow, an aerospace engineer out in Las Vegas, and he had lost his wife and his son had committed suicide. He had a deep interest in the afterlife, and he put up a few $1 million in prize money. And the question he asked was, what is the best scientific evidence for continuation of consciousness after permanent bodily death? That was the question. They got more than 1,000 positive responses of people who wanted to submit essays. Then they said, well, you've got to show at least 5 years of research experience in the field of afterlife studies. And then you could submit an essay. With that criterion, they received 204 essays, I believe. And then they announced the results last November. The good news is they originally were going to give out 3 prizes, ended up giving out 29 prizes because of the quality of the essays was so great, extraordinary quality. And I would say these essays, which are freely available to the public right now, if you go to bigelowinstitute.org, you can read all 29 winning essays. And what you realize is the afterlife from a scientific perspective is already proven. It's a fact. There is no doubt of the reality of it. Read these essays and you will see. Now, you can find a materialist scientist who might say, oh, it's all woo-woo nonsense, but all they're doing is saying that they are willfully ignorant.
I did find out. I did go on the internet and realize that was a near-death experience. I wasn't sure what to call it. I thought heaven just rejected me. I had actually heard a really robotic voice at the end as they were putting injections in me and paramedics were coming in. I heard this voice say, your work has not started yet. And I thought, What do you mean? I'm in a PhD program. I work 50 hours a week. I'm working my tail off, and so what really helped me was to go online and find out, oh, that is a near-death experience. I thought you had to be on the operating room table and your heart stop and a bunch of doctors document it. And then they bring you back and you could call it a near-death experience. I started reading, just like you suggested, about all these different experiences. And I also started journaling. I started just sort of like an after effects journal. And once I faced all of it, I could just put away the drink. I could just not want to escape it or not want to, I was scared that I had been living my life wrong. And so I think the message is we get these sort of like setups in our life, things that they do happen for a reason. I'm not one of those people that says every little thing happens for a reason. I don't know. I think there's a dance that we do with consciousness, with the universe. But if you allow an unfoldment within you, and you allow yourself to look at our earthly world through new eyes of connection, that beautiful things can happen.
Well, that is beautifully put. And I think in many ways, you've hit the nail on the head. And what I would say is, in many ways, this is kind of a dance between our ego mind. The ego does serve a role in, predator prey, that kind of dance. But with advanced humans and spirituality, that ego, it can just get us in trouble. I mean, it's at the heart of all addictions. Alcoholism is always about the ego, and the ego would rather see its host dead than see itself dead. That's why addictions and alcoholism can be so deadly and dangerous. But this is about seeing that you're not that ego. I mean, so many of us think we're that running stream of thoughts in our head, that, that's what we identify with. And one of the earliest things I learned after my coma is that little ego mind is not who I am. And I learned this through meditation. And this is what I would strongly urge anyone and everyone out there. If you haven't had an NDE, my suggestion for how best to glean the deep lessons of an NDE is start meditating. And for me, meditation is just another form of centering prayer, but it's a form of going within and acknowledging kind of a higher soul and a connection with others. And that connection, as NDEers teach us so well, is about love, the binding force of love, unconditional love. And the more that we can bring love into our lives. I mean, I realized after my coma that part of the problem is we don't even love ourselves enough. We think, you don't love your neighbor, you don't love your enemy enough. Well, guess what? So many of the troubles in our world is we don't honor ourselves as those sacred divine beings that have the higher interest of all involved through acknowledging the love that binds us together. That's the deeper lesson here. And sometimes our egos fight that. And I think with your discussing your use of alcohol, I mean, I'm familiar with problems with alcohol. I stopped drinking in 1991, as I mentioned in the book, Proof of Heaven. In fact, that was what took my birth sister from this world, was alcohol. And so we shared that deep bond, but that is what brings out these issues of the ego. And we can escape that. We don't have to be victims of our ego and what it tries to demand of us. And that's where prayer, meditation, humility, and coming in with a sense of love. And that's why I think NDE is the most profound lesson they bring back to this world. Not just NDEs in the modern era in the West, but if you read Gregory Shushan's work on indigenous NDEs going across this world back thousands of years, you'll realize the commonalities are there, especially for what you mentioned a few minutes ago, encountering souls of departed loved ones. In fact, before my coma, I would have told you, oh yes, that's obviously a hallucination. And since my coma, I was at a medical meeting where they were discussing terminal delusions. And I finally had to stand up in this room full of 300 plus doctors and say, some of the stories y'all are sharing are not of delusions at all. They're what are called terminal lucidity or paradoxical lucidity. And that is where someone who has been going deep into coma, dementia at the end of their life, just before they die, they wake up. And they come back to life. They interact with the loved ones at the bedside. They often see loved ones standing at the foot of the bed. I described such a case in the book, Proof of Heaven. And I used to think, seeing the loved one at the bedside meant it was a hallucination. I now realize that is the imprimatur that says this is an authentic spiritual experience. Pay attention. My mother had the very same thing happen. She was passing from this world in April of 2019. She was 99 years old. The last 4 days of her life, she was deeply unresponsive with an upper respiratory infection and fever. But 2 nights before she passed, none of us were there, but her nurses were there. And she woke up, got out of bed, woke her nurse up and said, call my children. My mother's here. My mother's here. This is amazing. And unfortunately, the nurse did not call us that night, but I was on my way there and heard this a little bit later. And by the time I got there, mom was unresponsive again and then passed 2 days later. But the fact that she saw her mother, to me, I knew that's it. That means this is the real deal. She's probably, hours to days from passing. And that's why I hurried home. But terminal lucidity is a beautiful example of how the brain is not the creator of consciousness, that in fact it's a filter that reduces and limits consciousness down to this tiny trickle of an apparent here and now and sense of self. And we can escape that through meditation, through centering prayer, where we come into this knowing of the higher good, that we're all in this together, an all-inclusive form of love, compassion, and kindness for others. That's the deepest lesson of NDEs. One of my favorite books supporting that is by a friend, Christopher Koppes, Koppes, and his book is called The Essence of Religions. He compares all 5 of the major world faiths with NDEs. And basically, NDEs, writ large over centuries across all belief systems, set the standard for the deep lessons of the golden rule, which NDEers find in that life review. You know, the way we treat others should be the way that we would want to be treated. And if we violate that, we're going to feel the pain of that in our life review, because the life reviews are more commonly described as the emotional perspective of those around us who are affected by our actions and even our thoughts. And so that is a beautiful example of how that little ego self and that sense of self is basically sharing the dream of the one mind, of that God force. And the only other point I would make about that is it doesn't matter if you want to call that force God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit. Those names claim a certain amount of knowledge that we really don't have as human beings. When you simply admit that NDEers encounter this beautiful force of love, and we can call it any one of those names. But the reality is it's real, absolutely real. And that to me was one of the greatest gifts, was to realize in the core realm, in the deepest part of my journey, that our very conscious awareness is sourced in that God force. And that only as we get way, way, way out from that core realm through the other spiritual realms I discussed, like the Gateway Valley, and through the Earthworm's eye view, do we get down to this very dense material realm where we live in these bodies, and we don't remember past lives and between lives. But as the scientific groups who study past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation will tell you, you have to study those, get those memories from the children before age 5 or 6, because beyond that point, the memories are covered over by natural processes. And then to remember those between life and past life memories takes something like an NDE or deep meditation, hypnotic regression, etc. But the literature is so strong on these past life cases. For example, if you go to uvadops.org, that's University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, you'll find more than 2,700 cases of past life memories in children over the last 6 decades that they have investigated, and 1,700 of those cases are solved. That is, they actually found the person who lived before. And many of these cases come from the 1960s and 70s, long before the internet, when they had to do a very deep dive to identify the person who lived before. But in this extraordinary number of cases, they found that's true. So anyone who wants to explain consciousness, the brain-mind connection, the nature of reality, must explain reincarnation too, because it doesn't matter if you believe it or don't believe it or what have you, the scientific evidence is overwhelming that it's real. And I have to warn people about that, because I know some people have been tempted, you know, when they face this world, they hear about NDEs, they hear about that beautiful world over there, and they might commit suicide because their life is so, you know, to them seems too bad. And sadly enough, if you do that, all you do is repackage all of those issues that you didn't face in this lifetime, and they'll be presented in the next lifetime. And you'll have to deal with them there. So better to deal with it now and here.
I think it's time to take some questions. Donna, so you're on with Dr. Eben Alexander. What's your question?
Thank you, Susanne and Dr. Alexander. This is a special session. I was 14 years old and I was in a car accident. And I call this my near-death experience, because I was shown I had a life review. It was done on playing cards, and they were just sort of flipped, and it was like, and when I went through that life review, there was nothing negative. There wasn't a negative feeling or anything. And then I felt God there. Now, I believe in God, but I believed not knowingly, as I know today, a very benevolent God. There was not a punishing God or a vengeful God. So it was a very peaceful experience. When I knew I was going to hit this car, I was riding on the hood of a car. Long story. Anyway, when I knew I was going to hit that car, there was fear, right? Because I was going to be hurt. Transcended into peacefulness. I thanked God for my life after I saw these cards show my life review. And then I felt myself twirling around and I was on the ground and so forth. Years later, a news reporter on television had been in a helicopter crash. He was reporting the Iraqi war. And he said the exact same thing that had happened to me. He related that when he was interviewed. And I was like shocked because it was exactly the same. And I always thought,
what was exactly the same, Donna? In
that he had a life review, that it was on cards, that he had this peaceful feeling, same thing. And so listening to you both talk, it's like everybody in their NDEs are a little different. The circumstances are different and everything. This was exact. So that was like, what does that mean? I mean, is that happening to a lot of people and it's a format that happens? I don't know, but it's just been always, since I saw him being interviewed about that, it's always been a question in my mind.
I'll bet to see somebody have the exact style or format of life review. What do you think about that, Eben?
Well, Donna, thank you so much for sharing that experience. And I would say you had a near-death experience. It was not a near-death. I would say, going through a life review, that's a pretty powerful stuff. And I think, the important thing to realize is the more we read about these stories, the more we study them and take them en masse, and especially read some of the scientific work, like out of the University of Virginia. That UVA DOPS website is an incredibly powerful resource. And also the Bigelow Institute essays, because they're all experts and they dive deeply into a lot of these kind of stories. And that's where, to me, the real power comes from. And I must say, I'm most grateful for having told my story. Initially, when I decided to go public on it, I knew it was at some risk to my career as a neurosurgeon, because I was really rocking the boat here. And yet I also knew that what had happened to me was so important that I could not keep it in. But the gift to me is that by sharing that publicly in a book and then giving presentations, I've given more than 650 talks, in conferences and presentations to audiences over the last 14 years. And then I get people sharing theirs back with me. And usually it starts with somebody who comes up after I've given a talk somewhere, and very sheepishly they say, I want to tell you something that happened to me. Could have happened 50 years earlier. And they often say, and I've never shared this with anyone before, and then they'll tell me a story that in so many ways aligns with what I know about the NDE literature. It aligns with my story. It aligns with some of the deepest stories I've heard. And that has been a tremendous gift, because what that really showed me was how common these are. They're part of our basic human understanding of the nature of reality. And that, in fact, is the reason I wrote the book, Map of Heaven, because a lot of people would come up to me and say, oh, you're that Harvard neurosurgeon and have this extraordinary experience. And I say, no. Mine was like millions of others. These are very common. I'm no exception. I'm not anything unusual. The scientific community pays attention to mine because of the documented damage to my brain. But that all fits in the modern literature. I mean, for example, when you look at papers on functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, looking at specific brain activity, for example, under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, what you find is the brain goes dark. The brain gets out of the way. And people have the most extraordinary phenomenal experiences on that kind of plant medicine or entheogen or psychedelic substance. The brain is not creating it. The brain is actually going dark. And I knew what that felt like, to have the brain go dark, because my meningitis made my brain go dark. If you had been assessing it with that functional MRI, that's exactly the kind of thing that would have been seen. So to share these experiences, to share in the extraordinary reality of the primacy of mind, and also an acknowledgement that free will is absolutely essential. We are responsible for our choices. Materialist science would try and deny that, so you don't even have free will. But in fact, this quantum-informed science of consciousness, which is the way all the evidence leads, and it's where the world is headed, fully tells us we're responsible for our choices. The way we treat ourselves, the way we treat others, the way we treat this planet, and I would say that false sense of separation inherent in materialist thought is responsible for much of the damage in our modern world. The kind of corporate greed and climate change, all the big problems with warfare, conflict, violence, all have to do with this false notion that we're separate from each other. But NDEs show us we are together, that we are here to love each other. And the more that lesson can filter through, the more we can rescue this world from the incredibly bleak and paltry fiction of materialist thinking. So thank you for sharing your story. And this is what we all need to get out there.
It's great that she is sharing that she saw her life review in a certain style and then heard on the news that somebody else did too. And that would, to me, indicate there's probably thousands of people who saw it in that style. So no preconceived notions, and right. The fact that we're all in a unity consciousness, in a way, our souls have shared all of the experiences. Ooh.
Well, I think the best part about it all is really that this is a scientific revolution. It's been at least 5,000 years in the making. Quantum physics was kind of the capstone that showed us primacy of mind. And this is where the world heads forward, acknowledging that we're all truly in this together, and we need to take care of each other. And also very important to point out that spiritual existence is not just something that humans possess, but that all animals are deeply involved in this world that is the universe within consciousness.
Well, speaking of, did I see a kitty cat?
More respect.
Sorry, did I see a kitty cat going behind you a minute ago?
That is one of our dogs. The dogs are here.
Okay.
Professional consultants.
Yes, but I have a dog.
Anybody
who
has a pet knows that animals have a soul too, and a spiritual reality. And to deny that is to deny the love we can feel in the presence of our pets. Horses. We really need to treat animals with a lot more respect, and that certainly has to do with our food industry. You might argue that we're omnivores and that animals eating animals is part of the natural order, but there's no question that the horrible way that humans treat animals in the food industry, caging them for life, et cetera, we really must reject all that kind of horrible behavior with animals, because animals are with us in this spiritual realm.
Amen.
And it's very important to acknowledge that and to take care of all of our fellow beings.
Well, I think we have another question. Diane has a question. Go ahead, Diane.
Yes, I saw a post on Facebook with Afterlife group that had a very interesting question, and I thought I'd bring it up here. The question was, if a blind person has a near-death experience, how is it that that person would report seeing others and seeing things in that experience if they're blind?
Well, I think that brings up a very important point. When we are seeing and hearing and witnessing, experiencing things on these journeys, we're not seeing with the eyes. We're not hearing with the ears. There are much higher modes of knowing that have to do with kind of resonance at that higher level. People often talk about a vibrational state. Well, that's what happens, is we kind of connect with the aspects of that information field that are important in our soul journey. And what you're referring to has been written up scientifically in a beautiful book. I think it's called Mindsight by Kenneth Ring. He was one of the original founders of the International Association of Near-Death Studies back in the mid-1970s. And he wrote that beautiful book, and it was about, I think, approximately 20 cases. I don't recall the details. But some people congenitally blind, that is, they've been blind from birth, and others who had been blinded after having some sight. But the extraordinary thing was they could see stuff during their NDE because we have perceptual modes beyond the physical realm. This is one of the cases we make in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, to support this notion of objective idealism, the primacy of mind, is all the evidence from parapsychology of knowledge that we can gain, like telepathy, telepathic experience, connection with other minds, is very scientifically validated. Just read Guillaume Playfair's book on twin telepathy. You'll never doubt the reality of telepathy again. And then also remote viewing, one of the most proven aspects of this kind of higher information field that we all can access if you learn the techniques of remote viewing. And it's been scientifically validated by people like Jessica Utz, the head of the American Statistical Association, in her presidential address in 2015, where she said that precognition, that is knowing the future a few seconds in advance, as well as remote viewing, were so well established scientifically that there's no reason to doubt them. And yet, because they touch on these kind of spiritual questions, people recoil, and there's this giant argument coming out of materialist scientists that it can't be true, it violates everything we know. Well, no, it doesn't. It just means you don't understand the measurement paradox in quantum physics for what it's trying to tell us about the mental layer of the universe and this kind of top-down causal principle that we all have access to. That's why placebo effect works. Things like that, mind over matter, and especially miraculous healing in NDEs, like my case, healing from this meningitis, unprecedented in the medical literature. Or Anita Moorjani's Dying to Be Me. She healed her advanced stage 4 lymphoma by having a near-death experience. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, who wrote the book To Heaven and Back, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile in the late 1990s. And you ask any doctor about that, 30 minutes plus warm water drowning, no way that brain is anything more than liquefied. And yet she had a full return to complete function as an orthopedic surgeon. And I presented with her before in NDE conferences. So this extraordinary healing, I think that's the biggest gift of it all. And that's why Karen and I, for example, are doing a Shift Network course in just a few weeks, all about spiritual healing, about taking the power of this kind of acknowledgement of the mental layer of the universe and the true power of our free will to bring wholeness and healing into our lives, and just realize we can do that by having this kind of understanding that originates in near-death experiences and similar experiences, but ultimately show us the power we have as souls to rise far above that little ego mind in kind of manifesting the world of our dreams. So it's all just a tremendous gift that greatly enhances our abilities as human beings.
Well, in our final minute here, can we talk about sound and that beautiful healing effect of sound, and then that incredible music that one can hear in a near-death experience? To me, because I play instruments and read music, I can be a little bit descriptive, but I'll never be able to fully communicate the beauty of the sound there. How have you integrated sound healing into your sharing with all of us?
Well, very good question. Of course, sound was crucial in my journey, as I reported in Proof of Heaven. Sound, remembering the notes of the musical melody, is what allowed my soul to traverse these various planes in the spiritual realm. And that's very, very important theme. And of course, we're not hearing sounds with ears there, as I've already said, but that is how we remember this kind of vibrational signature, is by music. And of course, it's some of the most beautiful music ever heard. Now, importantly, in the last 11 years, I've used meditation based on sound. People who want to learn more, go to sacredacoustics.com. But it has to do with the fact that binaural beat brainwave entrainment, which I first discovered about 2 months after my coma, was absolutely essential at helping me get into a deep and powerful, life-changing mode of daily meditation using binaural beat brainwave entrainment. It's been proven to relieve anxiety and to help with suicidal ideation, things like that. There's a beautiful pilot study in peer-reviewed literature by Dr. Anna Yusum looking at sacred acoustics. And she found actually a 27% reduction in anxiety symptoms in her busy Manhattan practice over 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics, versus only a 7% improvement in those symptoms in people who had talk therapy but didn't listen to the tones. So extraordinarily powerful. I've been using sacred acoustics daily for the last decade plus. I've used it to return to my NDE. Karen and I teach workshops And you can learn a lot more at sacredacoustics.com, at ebenalexander.com about all of this. And also unitedinhopeandhealing.com is a resource that Karen and I created. It was Karen's brilliant idea, but that has to do with interviews that we did of people, scientists and other experiencers that we interviewed during the pandemic, and put those out for free in unitedinhopeandhealing.com, or innersanctumcenter.com is another way to access that information. But they're there to help change the world, to give people the gift of this understanding and knowledge through these interviews that we did with other people. And much of it has to do with sound and the ability of differential frequency brainwave entrainment to lead us into wholeness of the soul, and really to share this binding force of love with all of our fellow beings.
Well, and I can tell you, I have been in person with you and the magnificent Karen Newell. And I was telling you earlier about going completely out of body. Of course, that's something that I practice and do, but I know that anyone can be helped with the binaural beats and the sound healing, especially what you're offering. Thank you for all the free resources that you've given us. And I want to thank you, Dr. Eben Alexander, for sharing so much with us. Thank you so much.
Well, Susanne, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks so much for what you do to get this out to the world. Very important role. You have my deepest appreciation. Thank you so much.